Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 86. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 50 and 51 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of habits and of the cause of habits as to their formation. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether there is a habit in the body. Does the body have good or ill dispositions? And we know that it does. A person's body can go from bad to worse. Its quality can change from healthy to sick or vice versa. In the words of Aquinas, a habitual disposition can be in the body, health, and such like are called habitual dispositions. Yet they have not the nature of habit perfectly, because their causes of their very nature are easily changeable. Article 2, whether the soul is the subject of habit in respect of its essence or in respect of its powers. So does the soul in itself, or according to its essence, require certain dispositions? And it doesn't, because what it is doing according to its essence is making you to exist as a human being. And in that act, there is not better or worse, there just is or is not. Your rational soul either exists or does not exist. There's not a modifiable middle between those 2 points, according to your essence. Now, your faculties or powers can definitely undergo modification. They can take on a certain quality, but they are not your essence. But those powers or faculties which flow from your essence already existing. So habits are not in your soul according to its essence, but instead within those powers of your essence as already existing, which do have the possibility of being disposed better or worse, either in regard to themselves or in regard to some act. In Aquinas' words, the essence of the soul belongs to human nature, not as a subject requiring to be disposed to something further, but as a form and nature to which someone is disposed. So your soul, the form of your body, does not require a disposition according to its essence and is, in fact, disposing your body at any moment to exist, and to exist specifically as the body of a human being. Lastly, Aquinas will say that the essence of our soul, although it does not require a disposition naturally, can be elevated to a super kind of nature by God's grace, to be partakers of the divine life. As Aquinas continues, if we speak of a higher nature of which man may become a partaker, according to 2 Peter chapter 1, that we may be partakers of the divine nature, thus nothing hinders some habit, namely grace, from being in the soul in respect of its essence, as we shall state later on. Article 3, whether there can be any habits in the powers of the sensitive parts. Here we are talking about the faculties we have in common with irrational animals. Can there be stable dispositions in our sensitive, apprehensive powers like sight, hearing, touch, imagination, or in the sensitive, appetitive powers, the passions or emotions? First, in regard to the external senses, St. Thomas says, the exterior apprehensive powers as sight, hearing, and the like are not susceptible of habits, but are ordered to their fixed acts, according to the disposition of their nature, just as the members of the body, for there are no habits in them, but rather in the powers which command their movements. Then in regard to the internal senses, Aquinas says, in the interior powers of sensitive apprehension, we may admit of certain habits whereby man has a facility or ease of memory, thought, or imagination. Then in regard to the sensitive appetitive faculties or passions, he writes, sensitive powers have an inborn aptitude to obey the command of reason, and therefore habits can be in them, for insofar as they obey reason, and in the powers of sensitive appetite, habits do not exist except according as they act at the command of the reason. And as succinctly put in the Gilby translation of the Summa, the faculty which is acted upon acquires dispositions. The appetitive, sensitive faculties can have dispositions because they are acted upon by the rational will. But the cognitive sense faculties, so think about sight, hearing, touch, cannot have dispositions because they are not acted upon, but rather act upon the rational cognitive faculties. So in brief, things like sight or hearing cannot be given dispositions by our mind because they are informing the mind and not the other way around. But the will, by acting upon our passions and seeking to command them as much as we can then bestow dispositions upon them. All of this allows us to respond to our article that there can be habits in the sensitive part of the soul. Article 4, whether there is any habit in the intellect. Because the intellect can be better disposed, it can be the subject of habits. And we know this is the case by experience, since there is a very clear difference between before we learn a thing to when we later choose to consider that same thing, which we then have learned. The difference in the mind between learning something and later recalling it is that in the latter case, we possess the habit of it, the habitual knowledge of the thing now learned. We can possess the habit of science when we have the habitual knowledge of certain conclusions, like the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. We can have the habit of understanding, which is our habitual knowledge of first principles, such as the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason. We can have the habit of wisdom, which is the habitual knowledge of the highest causes within a certain category or branch of human knowledge. These habits serve as a midway quality in the mind between actually or presently considering some particular truth, and then on the other hand, being completely unaware of it. In St. Thomas's words, wherefore nothing forbids habit to be in the intellect. It is midway between pure potentiality and perfect act. Article 5, whether any habit is in the will. The will is inclined to the good in general, and as proposed to it by reason, but since the good can be attained in many various kinds of ways, the will requires a tendency or qualities to direct it to the particular among those options which it can be inclined to. In St. Thomas's words, as found in the Gilby Summa, in order to reach the goal of human life, it is necessary for the appetitive power to tend to some definite things, to which it has not by nature sufficient tendency, for the faculty by its nature has an equal tendency to many different things. And so it is necessary that the will and other appetitive faculties should possess qualities which endow them with tendencies, and these qualities are called dispositions. And those stable dispositions are what we mean by habits. Therefore, in response to our article, it is true that there must be habits in the will. Article 6, whether there are habits in the angels. Since the angels have, along with ourselves, the faculties of intellect and will, just as we have habits in those faculties, so too would we expect that angels would as well. The nuance between our habits and the angels, in regard to the intellect, is that our intellect is at first a blank slate, or a tabula rasa in the Latin. Knowledge comes to us through the senses, but we don't just have it innately from the moment of our creation. The angels, on the other hand, since their intellects are from their creation united to their immaterial and therefore knowable essence, they understand it immediately, as well as whatever other knowledge is being infused into them by God. And it is the latter of those two which is the cause of their intellectual habits. And Aquinas will say the more perfect the angel is, the more will it know naturally or just via its nature and without recourse to these additional intellectual qualities or habits. In his words, the human intellect being the lowest in the intellectual order is in potentiality as regards all intelligible things. The angelic intellect is not as a pure potentiality in the order of intelligible things, but as an act, not indeed as pure act, for this belongs to God alone, but with an admixture of some potentiality, and the higher it is, the less potentiality it has. And therefore, so far as it is in potentiality, so far is it in need of habitual perfection by means of intelligible species in regards to its proper operation. And now on to question 51 of the cause of habits as to their formation. Article 1, whether any habit is from nature. Speaking of man specifically, if we take from nature to mean acquired easily, and because of the kind of thing that we are, then there are certain habits of the mind, like the knowledge of first principles, what we call the habit of understanding, that do come to us in a way based on our rational nature. Not that these are innate truths, but that these truths come to us easily in a stable way, in a way that other intellectual habits are not. Some of these truths would include, as we mentioned, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason. Aquinas gives his own example in the following words. The understanding of first principles is called a natural habit, for it is owing to the very nature of the intellectual soul that man, having once grasped what is a whole and what is a part, should at once perceive that every whole is larger than its part, and in like manner with regard to other such principles. Yet, what is a whole and what is a part, this he cannot know except through the intelligible species which he has received from phantasms. Then in regard to the body, certain men and women can have particular natural dispositions to chastity or meekness, St. Thomas says. And lastly, in regard to the appetitive powers, St. Thomas will say, we do not have natural dispositions unless what we mean by a habit of the will is, and this is a quote from a later part of the Summa, the nurseries of moral virtues, insofar as there is in the will a natural appetite for good, in accordance with reason. Article 2, whether any habit is caused by acts. Our guiding principle for this article is the following from Aquinas. Everything that is passive and moved by another is disposed by the action of the agent. Wherefore, if the acts be multiplied, a certain quality is formed in the power which is passive and moved, which quality is called a habit, just as the habits of moral virtue are caused in the appetitive powers, according as they are moved by the reason, and as the habits of science are caused in the intellect, according as it is moved by first propositions. In other words, as your will affects or moves your passions, it creates over-repeated acts a quality in them, a habit. Also, as your intellect affects itself in the way of working from a premise to a resulting conclusion, or affects the will by acting upon it, it can bestow qualities or habits as well. Article 3, whether a habit can be caused by one act. Aquinas will take this not to be the case in the majority of cases, that just as fire takes time to dry out the wood before it can bestow upon it the quality of being inflamed, so too it takes time or multiple acts of the intellect considering a certain thing before it can be placed firmly in our memory, along with multiple acts upon the will before it be inclined like nature to the same thing in the majority of cases, which inclination belongs to the habit of virtue. However, when it comes to the body, its disposition can be greatly altered by a single act. Think about resetting a bone or a wound being received into the body. Article 4, our last article, whether any habits are infused in man by God. And this has to be the case because we have a supernatural end or goal given to us by God, the beatific vision, which, in order to reach that goal, will require an elevation of our soul according to its essence, a kind of divinization by the infusion of grace, as well as the habits which flow from that grace, sanctifying grace, habits in the intellect and the will, which are in this life requisite for us to have a knowledge of this beatific goal and a proper inclination to it. These infused habits, faith, hope, and charity, for example, which we will cover in turn later in the Summa, Aquinas says in this article, there are some habits by which man is disposed to an end which exceeds the proportion of human nature, namely, the ultimate and perfect happiness of man. And since habits need to be in proportion with that to which man is disposed by them, therefore it is necessary that those habits which dispose to this end exceed the proportion of human nature, wherefore such habits can never be in man except by divine infusion, as is the case with all gratuitous virtues. Which brings us to the close of another episode on the habits, of which again we will have many, many more to come. We have just finished covering questions 50 and 51 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of habits and of the cause of habits as to their formation. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow